Professor Roos, you're up. Professor Roos will make an opening statement and then submit to questioning.
I've been told I've got a minute and a half to make an opening statement. I'm a philosopher. I've never said anything in a minute and a half, I'm afraid. I can't even get to the verbs in a minute and a half, so let me make my points very quickly. I accept evolution, the fact of evolution, so you know where I stand on that. I believe in a tree life form all the way up to us from some 4 billion years ago. I am myself a Darwinian. I think that natural selection is the major mechanism. I recognize that there is significant debate amongst evolutionists as to how far natural selection goes. I think we all accept natural selection probably as the major mechanism. Most don't go as far as I do and Richard Dawkins do, but certainly I accept natural selection. Creation, I quite often use the word creation in my writings, and I don't mean it sarcastically any more than Charles Darwin did. However, I don't accept creationism with a capital C. I think that this is a form of fundamentalist religion. I don't think it's science. I certainly don't think it's good science, but frankly, folks, I don't think it's very good religion either, whether you're a Protestant, whether you're a Catholic, or whether you're a Jew, or any other of the major religions. So that's where I stand.
Thank you, Professor Roos. Professor Jonathan.
Michael, in your book, Darwinism Defended, you say that many contemporary Darwins show a strong liberal commitment in their politics and sexual morality, whereas advocates of creation want to go back to a strict biblical morality. And you conclude the chapter by saying, Darwinism has a great past. Let us work to see that it has an even greater future. Isn't that something very inappropriate to say of a scientific theory? Do you ever hear anyone say gravity has had a great past? Let's work together to see it has a great future.
Well, why not, Phil? Why not indeed? I mean, I'm all in favor of gravity having a great future. In fact, I'm taking a plane tomorrow. I'll be very worried if gravity gives up. No, I mean, the point is, it's certainly the case that many Darwinians, many evolutionists have been liberal, but by no means all. You know and I know that there have been many evolutionists who've been, I won't say to the right of Mr. Buckley, but certainly in that corner, if you know what I mean. Certainly there have been Darwinians, Sir Ronald Fisher. I mean, his social views, you know, make one sort of wake up in the middle of the night and sweat. So certainly, well, make me anyhow, certainly lots of people have held conservative views. I suspect you're probably right. I suspect that most scientists today accept more liberal views than conservative views, but I don't see an absolute connection. But I do agree. I do hope that Darwinism does have a great future, and I hope that you and I can contribute together to do this.
Well, we're going to do our best to see that it doesn't have a great future. You've given a very sonorous description of change in the universe. I'm wondering whether your worldview includes a scientific theory that would be recognizable by any physicist or a mathematician. Things change, I entirely agree, they do change. Is there something to Darwinism beyond that?
I've got a kind of feeling that this is the kind of question, if I say yes, you're going to catch me. Of course.
That's why
and if I say no, you're going to catch me too.
That's
right. Of course, my worldview accepts scientific theories. My worldview accepts theories of physics.
But where is the scientific theory of biology that you're proposing to endorse?
Yes, I think that Darwinism is a scientific theory. Of course, I think
and the Mississippi is a river, but where is the theory beyond having named it?
Where is the theory?
Yes, where is it? I've never been able to discern it. Simply saying that things change is not a theory.
You and I are both philosophically trained, and you know that we're both into rhetoric at this point, because you know perfectly
That's all
well.
there is.
No, let's be serious about this for a moment. You know perfectly well that if you look at the work, say the writings of somebody like Richard Lewontin, you're certainly, and his mentor, Dobzhansky, you're certainly going to find theories there where people are putting forward Mendelian genetics, they're putting forward the Hardy-Weinberg law, where people are showing how selection can work on this, where they went out, studied fruit flies, both in nature and experimentation.
I agree entirely. The emphasis of the question can always be displaced by the mechanism of fog dispersion. My question is, with respect to the great aching global questions of life, where is the theory that you propose as an explanation? Does it go beyond the mantra, random mutation and natural selection, or is there some solid theory that a physicist would recognize that an engineer could implement?
Well, I don't accept the word mantra. You see, once again, you're using a persuasive definition which you're slipping in there. Of course it's a global theory. If you go, say, to island biogeography, the work that Darwin did, looking at the finches, looking at the reptiles on the Galapagos, why are they similar but different, similar to South America, not similar to Africa? Because they came there and they evolved.
Mr. Ruth. Mr.
Michael,
B, sorry.
Michael versus Michael.
In 1989, the editor of Nature magazine, John Maddox, wrote an editorial with the interesting title, Down with the Big Bang. And in it he wrote, creationists and those of similar persuasion seeking support for their opinions have ample justification in the doctrine of the Big Bang. That, they might say, is when and how the universe was created. And he didn't like that and declared it to be, quote, philosophically unacceptable, the Big Bang theory. So my question is, as a philosopher, do you think scientists use non-scientific criteria sometimes for their evaluation of theories?
Oh, absolutely. No question about that. But I'm not doing so at the moment.
But John Maddox may have done so in the past.
Well, he's an editor.
Mr. Berlinski, you want to continue? Or Mr. Buckley?
To what extent do we rely on metaphors and exchanges of this kind? You've resisted Mr. Johnson's saying that that in such arguments metaphors have been loaded and are tendentious. You say, well, you're not doing that. Does that mean you disavow those who do, as a matter of as a philosophical matter, or simply as a polemical matter?
No, Mr. Buckley, I take metaphor very seriously. I think that one uses metaphors in religious contexts, certainly in political contexts, and there's no question but that one uses them in scientific contexts as well. I mean, natural selection, struggle for existence, arms race today, selfish gene, I mean, these are all metaphors. So I fully accept that science, contemporary science, if you like, is loaded with metaphors. I've never denied that. But the question is, where do you go from there? Does that mean it's purely a human creation, or does that mean that having devised a theory, whether it's Behe's theory or somebody else's theory, can we then go out and check it against the world? And I think that one can in science, and I think that, despite what Mr. Berlinski says, I think that one can in evolutionary biology, and evolutionary biologists do just that.
Thank you, Mr. Roos. Mr. Berlinski, it's your opportunity to make an opening statement. It's your opportunity to make an opening statement.
Darwin's theory of evolution is the last of the great 19th century mystery religions. And as we speak, it is now following Freudianism and Marxism into the nether regions. And I'm quite sure that Freud, Marx, and Darwin are commiserating one with the other in the dark dungeon where discarded gods gather. The problem facing us at the end of the 20th century, with a magnificent body of theoretical accomplishment in physics and mathematics, and a very rich body of descriptive material in biology, is to come to an understanding that when it comes to the large global issues that Darwin's theory is intended to address, we simply do not have a clue. This is a daunting admission to make, but if we're intellectually honest, we should make it. The mechanism that Darwin proposed, that of random search or a stochastic shuffle, is known to be inadequate in every domain in which it's applied. It's known to be inadequate in linguistics, and it's certainly inadequate when it comes to the overwhelming complexity of living forms. There is no reason on earth to believe that this mechanism is adequate to the task that it sets itself. If it should come to pass in the fullness of time that we discover that there is no explanation for life, we will have to accept it. If it should come to pass that we discover in the fullness of time that the only explanation for life is that it is a process designed for transcendental purposes by a transcendental figure, we will have to accept that too. And if that should come to pass, I would like to ask, who among us will genuinely feel diminished? Thank you.
Don't go away.
Don't go away.
Mr. Berlinski, I do want to commend you for the rich description of biological systems and species in your commentary article. You claim that there are some species that have what you at one point referred to as weird characteristics that are nearly unique. For example, only a few plants eat insects or carnivorous. Why aren't all of them? You also ask, if evolution is true, quote, then why are women, but not cats, born without the sleek tails that would make them even more alluring than they already are? Well, now, aside from aesthetics, you know, I saw the Catwoman Batman film too, but aside from that, why... You don't seem to understand that different ecological environments in the distant past as well as today produce different adaptations. Why is that so strange to you?
You're right, I
that
don't
you would
understand
find it as a failure of evolution?
You're right, I don't understand it.
You
Makes
don't
no sense
understand that
scientifically.
different ecological spaces require different adaptability, that
No.
the same kind... You don't?
No.
Well, it seems fairly easy to figure out that if you're living in a desert,
That is the difficulty with the
finding
Darwinian
water would
position.
be
It's
more
always
important.
easy to persuade yourself that you've understood something when you haven't understood a thing. The issue before us is not whether retroactively we can explain an adaptation, but whether we can draw that adaptation from general principles. This is what Darwinian theory cannot do. And this is the requirement of normal science.
Well,
If I'm doing astrophysics, I have a dynamical theory. I can simulate the evolution of the universe, and I know where the theory agrees with the data and where it does not. I cannot do that in biology.
Well, then I
Whatever
think with a
happens,
simple sentence you
There's-
could. Random selections which make a species more likely to survive are beneficial. That's a very simple idea, and it explains why, in fact, some species survive and others do not.
I mean, adaptive differential reproduction is the definition of natural selection. Why is this
what
a
will
problem?
happen will happen.
What is this a
that
problem?
could not be the locus in which you repose your trust. What will happen will happen. Big deal.
No, that's not.
a
No,
theory.
adaptive differential reproduction is not what will happen.
That's just a large Latinate construction.
Let me ask another question.
Why don't you explain what that term means?
Well, I don't know. It may not necessarily enlighten our listeners, actually,
right.
because it is technical. But that's the whole point.
It's not technical.
I mean,
it just means what survives, survives.
One
We
of
know
the
that.
reasons, one of the reasons why people like me who deal with the creation evolution issue all the time get very frustrated dealing with, say, Institute for Creation Research people and so forth, is because they are constantly saying X didn't happen, and then it takes a great deal longer to explain why X did happen, gaps in the fossil record or whatever. Let me ask you a question about your commentary article.
Okay.
You said in your commentary article, page 20, the major transitional sequences in the fossil record are incomplete.
Yes, they are.
And you cited as your reference Romer's hot off the press 1966 article.
No,
Now, are you Romer? Romer is a very great man and very knowledgeable. 1966 is not exactly cutting-edge
You're absolutely
paleontology.
right.
Are you familiar, sir?
Let's turn to Carol.
No. Are you familiar with the research that's been done in the last 31 years? I can't imagine that, because you would realize that the major argument going on among paleontologists dealing with the reptile-mammal transition is where the hell do you draw the line? These things grade insensibly
is there
into
a
each other, and they
question that I can
have
answer?
no ability to say these guys are mammals, these guys are reptiles, because they roll into each
Yes,
other.
I agree with the tail end of your question. Late reptilian transition to mammal is well documented in the record, although nowhere near as well as Darwinian theory requires. That's a big distinction. But if you dislike the citation to Romer, who's a great figure in paleontology, let's look at Carroll's new book on chordate paleontology, hot off the presses, page 4, left side of the page, evolution heading, third paragraph, second sentence. What does he say? He says, the evidence shows that major transitions are missing from the fossil record, just as Eldridge, Gould, and Stanley
In reference to the chordates. Now, the fact that we don't
That's the
have all the
strongest case.
information...
That's the strongest
The fact
case.
that we don't have all the information... No, I was talking about the reptile-mammal transition.
Chordates
are very, very much
The
earlier.
problem is your argument is the
Chordates?
chordates. Vertebrates,
chordates,
that's us.
No, chordates
we're
are
all chordates here, Mike.
If you turn to the insects, the situation is catastrophic. There is no fossil documentation. None whatsoever. For the insects.
There's very good fossil
Very
documentation
poor.
for the
Butterfly,
relationship
Lepidoptera,
between ants
bang.
and wasps. There's excellent
Yes, there are
transition.
lateral
But
transitions,
we won't count them. Let's talk about the ones we don't have evidence for.
spiders, major insects groups, they
That's silly,
simply
yeah.
Mr.
appear.
Berlinski, you're never going to be satisfied. Every time
You're
that
right.
you find 16 new things, new fossils, to fill in the so-called fossil record that was missing. You just say find 16 more. So my question to you is, how many 16 to the what power do we have to discover
I'll
before
tell
you
you
accept this is
exactly.
true?
Here's what Darwinian theory rigorously requires. For every significant morphological or physiological feature in a modern species, we should have a panoply of intermediate forms that explains how they arise. We don't have them for some good reasons, but we have nothing like an explanation for the gaps that
Fog
exist.
is rolling in again.
I'm telling you, the species aren't there.
We were talking, first of all, about evolution, descent with modification. Now we've shifted over to mechanisms of evolution.
No,
Gotta
I haven't
watch that.
mentioned
And we're out
mechanisms.
of time. Thank you very much, Mr. Berlinski. Professor Miller, it's your chance to make an opening statement with more props.
Can't live without him. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed Dr. Berlinski's statement, because he focused in on one of the major deficiencies of the four people on the other side of the table who argue against evolution. And that major theoretical deficiency is they have no explanation for natural history. And to me, as an experimental biologist, I am frustrated if I do not see a theoretical framework into which the past can be explained. We know something about the past, and there are facts about the fossil record, and I'll tell you in a very general way one of those facts, and that is that fossils show a succession of types over time. Now, we know the other side advocates intelligent design as a primary characteristic of the fossil record. Let's explore the primary scientific characteristic of intelligent design when it is squared with the fossil record. The fossil record, and I can give you specific examples, is characterized best by sequences of appearances and disappearances. Now think what that means. What that means is that the characteristic that best describes the intelligent designer who would have designed this fossil record is incompetence. Because everything the intelligent designer designed, with about 1% exceptions, has immediately become extinct. Intelligent design has no explanation for the successive character of the fossil record. Evolution has a perfect explanation, and that is the appearance of new forms and the extinction of others. And if you see a scheme for the natural history of intelligent design presented by the other side tonight, you should treasure it, because they've never announced one before.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Don't go away. Mr. Beasley.
Ken, in my introductory remarks, I showed a picture of Haeckel's embryos, those little drawings of embryos looking the same and gradually turning into different
Indeed
forms.
you did, and I'm going to give you a hand, because the picture that you have right here, I have brought an enlarged copy for just to help you out.
Okay, thanks very much.
Anything I can do.
And you notice that it says in Science magazine of a couple months ago, Haeckel's embryos, fraud rediscovered.
Absolutely.
And which it says, not only did Haeckel add or omit features, Richardson and his colleagues report, but he also fudged the scale. And the author of the report says it looks like it's turning out to be one of the most famous fakes in biology. Now, in your very good biology textbook for high school, it reproduces Haeckel's drawings, and it uses them in the section of how we know evolution occurred. And it points to them as saying that embryos should be preserved in the early stages. Now, my question
Embryos should be preserved in the early stages?
Well, embryos conserved in the early stages.
Okay, I think we should all be preserved in our early stages.
My question is this. You know, you were victimized by Haeckel's fraud, as did everybody else. But do you think your publisher should notify school districts to have them tell teachers to point this mistake or this fraudulent activity out to students?
Oh, absolutely, and I would do better than that. First of all, the letters to my publisher changing these figures are already off. And secondly, what I have done for the textbook, and I appreciate the commercial for this, and I'd be glad to give the URL for those of you who are interested, is Joe Levine and I, my co-author, have set up an internet website in which we keep scientific updates to our textbook. And this is something which will go up in the website in a matter of days as a scientific update. I think it's very significant, and I appreciate your support on this.
That's great. I just have one more question, if I could squeeze it in.
Maybe we'll get back to you, Mr. Berlinski.
I'm sorry.
Professor Johnson.
Is next. In my discussion with Eugenie, we talked about the mechanism as the all-important thing. The creative power of the mutation selection mechanism as to produce all this genetic information.
Indeed.
What is the most powerful demonstration, in your opinion, that the Darwinian mechanism of natural selection has this great creative power?
Well, I would give you, you asked me for the most powerful one, and I will give you two. The first one that I will give you are the repeated observations of random mutation and natural selection, as you like to call them in your own terms, producing new species. And I can give you several examples of new species that have emerged within human observation. The best example that I can give you is a butterfly, a genus of butterfly known as Hedylipta. Hedylipta is a genus of butterfly that feeds on various plants. It's endemic to the Hawaiian Islands, which means it's only found there. And there turn out to be two species of Hedylipta with mouth parts that only allow them to feed on bananas. Now, why is that significant? It is significant because bananas are not native to the Hawaiian Islands. They were introduced about 1,000 years ago by the Polynesians. We know this from the written records of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And what that means is that by mutation and natural selection, these two species have emerged on the Hawaiian Islands within the last 1,000 years. And I think that's a very good case in point. And I'll give you another one if you would indulge me, but I figure you only asked for one. Want another?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, here's another. In the November 7th or November 14th issue of Science magazine, a number of investigators wanted to test the Darwinian hypothesis that you folks say is never tested. And the way in which they did this was to take the receptor protein for the human growth hormone. It's a receptor to which the human growth hormone fits in precisely, and they did a terrible genetic disservice. They mutated, they cut out an essential amino acid right in the middle of the receptor called tryptophan. With that gone, just like that mousetrap, it wouldn't have been expected to work. They then allowed a natural selection process to take place to see whether the cells, under their own observation, could mutate the receptor gene sufficiently to bind the receptor, and after 7 generations, lo and behold, there it was. And it illustrates beautifully the ability of natural selection to respond to mutations in proteins to co-evolve.
Mr. B.
I'd like to ask a different question. I do not find that result impressive, but we can talk about that later.
When you say you don't find it impressive, that's what Richard Dawkins calls the argument from personal incredulity.
But you realize
which is my evidence. My evidence against evolution is that I don't believe it.
Well, it's because of course, what it has to do. It has to create this immense amount of genetic information, much
Indeed,
more
sir.
complex than any,
Philip,
and
you're right.
without recording it in the fossil record.
Right.
That's
You know
why
what,
it's
Phil?
not impressive.
I just gave you 2 examples, and that's still not enough.
May I ask another question related to Haeckel's embryos?
Oh, absolutely.
You not only showed these embryos in your book, but like other people, you said that things should be that way. You said in your book, mutations that affect early stage of development are likely to be lethal or deadly, and that mutations that cause less drastic changes would occur at later stages.
Again,
you're not alone in this. Bruce Alberts, who wrote Molecular Biology of the Cell, says much the same thing. Now we know that is not the case, and that early embryos can in fact change. Because you and Bruce Alberts, the president of the National Academy of Sciences...
Is there a question?
Yes, here it is. Because you two did not, because you thought Darwinism would produce this result, which is now shown to be fraudulent, is it safe to say that no scientist in the world understands how Darwinism could affect embryology?
Oh, absolutely not. May I answer even though we're out of time?
Very briefly.
Okay, very brief answer is, you read a quote and you pretended it meant something else. The quote that you read was, mutations in the early stage are less likely to survive, not impossible, and then you pretended to say that it meant they couldn't survive. The fact that something is less likely, the fact that something is less likely, the fact that something, I'm answering, the fact that something is less likely does not rule it out. I agree with that, Alberts would agree with that, and I think everyone in the audience would agree with it too.
Professor Miller. Mr. Buckley will now submit the questioning from the opposition team.
Let me kick off, Mr. Buckley. I guess my basic question is, why are you on that side rather than ours? I mean, are your objections religious? Are you against evolution? Are you against natural selection? Are your objections religious? Are they social, or what?
Well, I object to the way in which your confederates will leave you out of it as a matter of politesse, conduct themselves. They conduct themselves by simply assuming that people who argue the contrary are naifs or ignorant. It seems to be manifestly they are not. But my objection to your position is its ideological fixity. What you're speaking from is a dogmatic position from which everything else derives, as one would expect. Right?
I can't help feeling it that Seton Hall University speaking from a dogmatic position is not necessarily a fault.
Well, no, that's quite correct. If you could give us a progenitor more conclusive than Darwin, we might accept his dogmas. The notion that all dogmas are equal is what?
False.
Is well, it's at least false, but it's also it's also a disguise, really, for unmethodical thought, I would guess. Well, go ahead. What line are you pursuing?
Well, basically, I'm trying to understand why it is that you're against evolution. I mean, I could well understand. Is it because Richard Dawkins has linked evolution with atheism? Is it because some evolutionists have been socialists? Why? Because if it is, we'll give you a list that you'd like.
No, let's not be silly. For scientific materialists, the materialism comes first, the science comes thereafter. So my quarrel, and that of most of my colleagues, is with the extent to which you seek to imperialize over the entire question to the point of opposing a creationist thought in scientific and departments within the schools. This seems to be quite unnecessary in order to advance your own postulates.
Ms. Scott.
Is it necessary to invoke the hand of the Almighty in something like understanding cell division or understanding an internal combustion engine? No. If not, why is it necessary in understanding the history of life?
It is so frustrating to say something, then have to say it again. I said in my opening statement, the second sentence, was that we don't demand that you acknowledge creation and displace evolution. We demand that you acknowledge creation as an alternative explanation, one which we find more plausible. Now, this is as far as I am ready to go in this exchange. I am a practicing Catholic. Under the circumstances, I've made certain commitments, but none of what I have said yet derives exclusively from that position. Mr. Belinsky is himself not a believer, and he's certainly eloquent in his dissent from your position.
I think well, go ahead, Ken.
Let me ask a question along those lines, because you bring up your faith, and I have to tell you that over the weekend, looking for a weakness, I read Nearer My God, your recent book, which I much admired. I thought it was a marvelous explanation of the faith that you and I share. And I want to read a quotation to you, and as everyone in the audience will know, I came tonight with the hope to be remembered as the guy with the placards. And the quotation is an important one. New knowledge has led to the recognition of more than a hypothesis in the theory of evolution. It is indeed remarkable that this theory has been progressively accepted by researchers following a series of discoveries in various fields of knowledge. The convergence, neither sought nor fabricated, the results of work that was conducted independently, is in itself a significant argument in favor of this theory. Would you care to speculate who said that, sir?
Well, the answer is I have no quarrel with it. Within 10 years after Darwin died, they were able to document to a point that he hadn't in the 20 years since he had visited Galapagos, a certain phenomena. I have no quarrel with those phenomena, but I think it's correct to classify them as microevolutionary, not macroevolutionary.
Well, in that point, I think you're in disagreement with Pope John Paul II, who made that statement. No,
wait a minute. Pope John Paul II said that he could not countenance any explanation which sought to account for the forces of living matter other than as mere epiphenomena of the matter, and are therefore incompatible with the truth about man.
And
I got no quarrel with-
as a Catholic, I agree completely with that. And also as an evolutionary biologist, I accept evolution as the scientific explanation for life's diversity.
Thank you. Thank you. You're dismissed. Mary Lynn, captain of the opposing team, will submit to questioning from the affirmative team. Mr. Berlinski, would you like to start?
First question. Mr. Lynn, in the New York Review of Books this year, the famous Harvard biologist Richard Lewontin, who has a very low opinion of much of what passes as evolutionary science, the work of Richard Dawkins, for instance, explained why he nonetheless believed in essentially that kind of scientific explanation. And he said it's because we, meaning scientists like himself, have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science compel us to accept a material explanation, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create a set of concepts that produce material explanations. And he said that commitment to materialism must be absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. That's a direct quote from Lewontin. What I want to ask you is that if he were to teach that in the public schools as a doctrine, that is the truth of materialism as equivalent to rationality, would that be an establishment of religion in violation of the Constitution?
No, it just would be bad teaching because it's an illogical assumption. The truth is that one can be a theistic believer in evolution, as I am, and have absolutely no embarrassment about either side of that equation. I think the doctor should have probably given me a call, and I would have explained that you do not have to accept this materialism in order to be a believer, that evolution's the best and only credible description of this magnificent thing we call evolution of life.
By evolution, do you have in mind a system which employs only material causes without any guidance from a pre-existing intelligence to produce all of these living things up to and including human beings?
No, I certainly find it thrilling that my concept of God actually permits a God who could choose to start a process called evolution and develop in the process an incredible number of species, all of which fit in to a unique ecological niche. I find that one of the thrills of my theology. It's nothing
you're speaking of God-guided evolution, then.
Of course I am, because most Americans, as we noted earlier, do in fact find no difference with that, because unlike the members of your panel, they understand that there are some questions that are theological, some are scientific, and that scientific questions don't involve, does God exist? That's not what your scientists should do.
Will you then support my effort that I've invited Eugenie Scott into already to get the National Academy of Sciences to explain clearly whether God-guided evolution is in fact permissible in the scientific area?
No, because science does not speak to that question at all. What you want science to do is to be able to speak...
They say it's unguided.
No, excuse me, I think they took that word out, didn't they?
The National Association of Biology Teachers took it out because it was too explicit. They imply the same thing pervasively throughout the statement, and so do all the other
I don't have any problem with them taking it out because it does have the implication that you suggested. I just think that what you want to do is make it impossible for someone to say with honesty and integrity that one believes in a divine creative process, a foot in the door, maybe more, all the way up to the knee in the door, and still believe that nothing, literally nothing that you have said or any of you have written, in fact, degrades the basic idea of evolution.
David Berlinski.
My interest in divine creation is negligible, but I do have a scientific question to ask you. In fact, two scientific questions, the second logical. Everyone familiar with the paleontological literature, every significant paleontologist says that there are gaps in the fossil record. Do you have a particular reason for demurring?
No, but there are gaps in the fossil record, of course, because the fossil record's only been examined for about 130 years.
I didn't ask whether there was an explanation for the gaps. I asked whether you agree that the fossil record is full of gaps.
Of course it has gaps.
Okay, so to that extent, the evidence does not support Darwin's theory of evolution.
No, that is absolutely wrong.
It follows as the night the day.
Of course not. How could you have a cell, for example, ladies and gentlemen, hundreds of millions of years old that would leave a fossil record? It would disintegrate. It would quite literally not be able to be found in the fossil record.
I never suggested that they may not be explanations of the gaps, but the fact that the fossil record does not on its face support Darwin's theory of evolution is a fact.
No, it does. It's just, your question was, does it prove everything yet? And the answer is, it doesn't prove anything yet. And once again, I say, how many times do we have to find those intermediate fossils? How many more steps in the progress from ancient horse to modern horse do we have to show you?
I gave you a quantitative answer. What would satisfy a scientifically respectable temperament? You spurned it. All I'm asking for is enlightenment on the significant point. Darwin's theory requires a multitude of continuous forms. We do not see that in the fossil record. In fact, major transitions are utterly incomplete. Will you accept that as an empirical fact?
Now, you sound like a guy who is writing a story about baseball, comes in the fourth inning and says, well, you know, I'm going to write about the fourth inning on. The first 3 innings didn't happen because I wasn't there to see them. The fact that we can't find every one of those intermediate fossils yet in 150,
we can't find any of the major transitions.
It's just that when we find them, Doctor, you say it's still not enough.
Thank you, Mr. Lynn. Thank you, Mr. Berlinski. Mr. Behe and Mr. Roos. The two Michaels, Professor Roos and Professor Behe. And Mr. Behe will start the questioning.
Michael, I love your writings. And in a recent article in the journal Theoretical Biology, you talked about origin of life studies. And you said, a couple of quotes, a great deal of the underpinning of discussions on the origin of life have been more philosophical than anything based in brute experience. And also, in origin of life studies, one ought to be alert for more than pure science, and that more may well be philosophical or metaphysical. And you say caveat emptor. I agree with you. Should students be taught this?
Should what?
Should high school students be told about your writings?
About my writings, or about origin of life? Well, I hope so. Goodness gracious, yes. I think that certainly there's a place for that. Whether one were going to discuss something like origin of life, say in a high school biology class, I think would be a different matter. Of course, in my country, in Canada, for instance, we have state-supported church schools, so there would be certainly no constitutional objection to that. I'm not sure that, for instance, given a lot of the things which are said about origin of life, whether it's Sagan or Lynn Margulis or that sort of thing, it would be appropriate at a high school biology level. But you know that, and I know that.
Well, now Ken has written a good book, and it really is an excellent book. But it does.
Appreciate these endorsements.
I do like it. I do like it. I urge people to look at it.
Haven't Ms. Scott and Mr. Lynn written good books?
No, haven't. Great books. Great books. But in Ken's book, he does talk about Stanley Miller's stuff, about protenoid theories. Do you think in discussion, when high school books do talk about origin of life stuff, they should consider the philosophical aspects as well?
I certainly think that they should cover it. I mean, at what level, at what depth? I think you have to take it on a case-by-case basis. If, for instance, you were going to ask high school students to, say, accept Haldane's Marxism as part of the theory, obviously not. If, on the other hand, one were going to talk about evolution and say, well, these are some of the well-known experiments, these are some of the things they've done, but look, folks, be very careful. People tend to read a lot of things into this, and I hope that a good teacher would do this. I'm quite comfortable with that. I mean, high school kids are pretty bright, you know, and pretty intelligent and pretty with it. I don't think that we should dumb down biology for them.
Good. Very good. Now, about 15 years ago, you, in a federal court of the United States, I think you said that one of the characteristics of science, scientific theory, is that it's falsifiable.
Yes, I did.
Is that correct? Can you tell me, I put up a picture of the bacterial flagellum earlier in this discussion. Can you tell me how one could falsify the assertion that it was Darwinian natural selection working on random mutation that produced that flagellum?
Well, I would have thought that, for a start, you'd look at some of the molecular evidence and see, for instance, whether or not that flagellum, is that how you pronounce it?
Yes, it is.
For instance, whether or not the molecular evidence is, whether it, at a molecular level, it's homologous, it looks similar to things that we want to put in the same class or the same grouping? Or, for instance, does it come out more like a human or something like that? I would have thought that if, for instance, your
flagellum, yes.
Thank you very much.
Like flagellate.
As I say, I'm a philosopher, so I'm not very good. I'm good at long sentences, but not long words. I would have thought that if this microorganism, let me cover myself there, came out with DNA which looked more like humans than humans look like...
We're talking about the flagellum.
No, you asked me for an example of falsifiability.
Answer this question, then go on the offensive. Answer this question, then go on the offensive.
Well, I am answering the question. I'm saying that if the DNA of that microorganism were closer to human beings than human beings are to chimpanzees, I think that Darwinians would need, a long night down at the local bar, quite frankly.
Now it's your turn to ask questions.
Oh, good-o. Well, I'm a little, it's a little mean. Nobody seems to be plugging my books quite as much as I'm plugging other people's books. But I did want to talk about Michael Behe's wonderful book, Darwin's Black Box, where I take it that, and one of the things I want to compliment you on, Michael, and this is not just rhetorical, but is the fact that unlike so many creationists, certainly creationists in the past, you haven't just attacked other people or other people's theories, but that you've tried to explain some views of your own. And I gather, well, I know that you've put forward this view about design and complexity. You describe it in terms which, well, the modesty factor doesn't seem to be too high. The result of these cumulative efforts to investigate the cell, to investigate life at the molecular level, is a loud, clear, piercing cry of design. The result is so unambiguous, so significant, that it must be ranked as one of the greatest achievements in the history of science. The discovery rivals those of Newton and Einstein, Lavoisier and Schrödinger, Pasteur and Darwin.
What's the question?
That's pretty heavy stuff. Tell us about this theory. Tell us, for instance, Newton's theory enables us to quantify, to make predictions. What is your theory?
Well, it's that you can detect intelligent design in the interaction of parts of systems. And it's not really, suppose you were out walking in a woods with a friend of yours, and all of a sudden a friend of yours was pulled up by the ankle by a vine wrapped around it, and as he was left dangling, you pulled him down and you reconstructed, and you saw that the limb was covered over with leaves and that the vine was staked down. You would immediately know that that was designed. It was not an accidental arrangement.
So a design means a designer. Are we talking about God now?
Well, most people think so. I think so, but I want to leave it open, and not just because I'm being coy.
Now, are we talking about a good God now?
Well, let me answer your first question. Francis Crick, in 1972, wrote a paper entitled Directed Panspermia. And the burden of the paper was essentially that problems with imagining an undirected origin of life on Earth were so severe that perhaps we should consider the hypothesis that space aliens sent a rocket ship filled with spores to seed life on Earth a long time ago. Now, if Francis Crick looked at the bacterial flagellum or the intracellular transport system or the blood clotting system and said he thought it was designed by a space alien, I would have no scientific quarrel with him. I argue that you can tell who a system was designed, but the identity of the designer is a more difficult question.
But is this designer responsible when things go wrong, or for parasites, these complex parasites?
Well, that's the argument from evil. That is, bad things happen to good people, and it's been discussed in religious literature for many, many years, going back to the book of Job.
What about complex parasites? Did this designer design complex parasites, or is that evolution?
No.
I mean, you get all the good things, and evolutionists get all the bad things.
All right. That's a very good line, and we'll end on that note. Mr. Buckley and Mr. Lynn. Mr. Buckley, your opportunity to question Mr. Lynn.
Yeah. Mr. Lynn, frankly, a little bit emasculated by the approach of you and your colleagues tonight, which is really very ingratiating, and it really delights me. But it seemed to me that you're conveying the impression that the evolutionist theory is other than what most people know it to be, which is materialist philosophy. Now, it's wonderful that, notwithstanding your affinity for that explanation of things, you still believe in the possibility of a creator, indeed even of a Christian creator. But what would you make with the following statement of Richard Lewontin? The primary problem, he means in the current confusion, is not to provide the public with the knowledge of how far it is to the nearest star and what dreams are made of. Rather, the problem is to get them to reject irrational and supernatural explanations of the world, the demons that exist only in their imagination, and to accept a social and intellectual apparatus, science, as the only begetter of truth. Now, that is the public voice, as I understand it, of the materialist evolutionists. Do you transcend it, or do you disavow it, or do you consider it inauthentic?
Well, no, I just disavow it, because I think that it is obviously possible to believe in the idea of a God who has a presence and an interest in humanity, without rejecting the overwhelming data that supports evolution and the failure of anything, Mr. Buckley, to in fact contradict it. In other words, you have picked a few squabbles with evolution, but you haven't even suggested for a moment what the mechanism is with which you would replace it.
Well, but what if one simply advances basic intelligence and says some such thing as that, in fact, a lot of monkeys turned loose over an infinite number of time would not reproduce Shakespeare? Does that sound as an arrogant rejection of random explanations for what we see about us?
No, not at all. I think that one of the great things about randomness and chance is that they are used in this process of evolution, as I personally view it, as remarkable tools within that toolbox of God's creative interest. I mean, to reject the idea that chance is something that could be used by the divine is to limit the power of the divine considerably. The divine is not sitting a bunch of monkeys in a building with a bunch of typewriters. I think we're a little more sophisticated than that, and I think that the process of evolution is far more creative than that.
I think you are more sophisticated, manifestly, by my criteria. But Richard Lewontin is a man with very substantial bona fides in your community. So if we want jointly to excommunicate him from the rational fraternity, I think we should do so piously.
Well, we Congregationalists, of course, don't excommunicate. That's one of the differences between us.
So therefore, we will do what with simply point to that as the excesses to which some nice people nevertheless go?
Oh, I think, frankly, Bill, that the truth on this side is that the folks who represent the position that we've been articulating have been very good about going to conferences and trying to separate people's scientific views from their religious ones. And I wish that the other side did the same thing. And I wish fundamentally that we could understand that some questions are theological questions, others are scientific, and we work better at solving and resolving and even discussing those questions when we realize that there are two kinds of language and two kinds of issues. There's nothing extreme about that position.
You can now ask philosophical and scientific questions.
Okay, well, Mr. Buckley, you know, I've heard it said that even God does not know the mind of William F. Buckley. But my question is the obverse. Do you know the mind of God so well that you could rule out the possibility that God conceived evolution as the process to bring his design to fruition?
Well, I decline to answer that question because...
On what grounds?
Well, because my imagination is finite and the Creator's is not. Under the circumstances, I simply pass, not only for tactical reasons, but for reasons of profound belief. I do find it when I can't answer. Go ahead.
No,
go
but,
ahead.
that only goes to half of the question, because the truth is that if you are saying that you cannot imagine that a God could be that creative, that imaginative, then aren't you limiting, in a very severe fashion, your construct of God? I think that's a very serious question. I
believe that there are mysteries, and that it is impossible to parse all of God's movements by applying to them the substantially resourcelessness of our own minds. I don't, ask me a simple one, can I account for the 5-year-old who, before we finish tonight, will have fallen in from a rooftop and be killed? No, I can't account for it. On the other hand, I don't think that the abundance of incidents of that kind are sufficient grounds for rejecting revelation.
Well, I'm not sure I would either, but I'm not sure that that addresses the question. But let's move from the theological to the scientific, which is what Michael suggested I could do. I'm trying to figure out now what it is about evolution that you find so intellectually challenging, that you reject it. Every single major scientific development over the past many decades that could have demonstrated that evolution was fundamentally flawed, every one of them proves quite the opposite. You all remember Gregor Mendel's bean experiments, and in terms of experimenting on inherited characteristics. We all studied that in high school. Carbon dating that shows that the Earth is billions of years old. Had it proved that it was very young, we would have had many evenings at the bar to discuss that. And even DNA research that shows that the DNA in chimpanzees and gorillas and humans is so close to being the same that we must have had a common ancestor. With all this evidence on one side, what line of science contradicts those powerful lines in support of our argument?
Well, what is in my judgment has happened is a rejection of the materialist explanation of everything that has happened. At the time that Darwin spoke, he seemed to give us a facile explanation for a lot of phenomena which we couldn't otherwise explain. But I think the developments of the last 100 years have given us a perspective, and that perspective makes increasingly unrealistic the notion that there is a materialist explanation for everything that's happening around us. Remember that you're saddled with some heavy baggage, Mr. Dawkins, who says we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism.
Well, Mr. Dawkins isn't here, so we're not yet saddled with him.
Sorry?
He's not here. We are not saddled with him.
Well,
I'm just asking you a question about science, which might make you more comfortable than the questions about theology.
You better practice the excommunicative arts.
Well, one final question. 15 years ago, before Pope John Paul II made his most recent pronouncement, he said this: "Sacred Scripture wishes simply to declare that the world was created by God." He continued, "The Bible does not wish to teach how heaven was made, but how one goes to heaven." Do you have any fundamental problem with that?
None whatever.
Well, neither do I. And I would once again offer you the same opportunity offered earlier by Michael to join this side and to separate the two kingdoms.
Thank you very much. Professor Johnson. Professor Johnson. Professor Johnson, it's your opportunity to be, or opportunity, if you wish to think of it that way, to be interrogated by the opposition team. Who would like to start?
Mr. Johnson, your career seems built on picking alleged fleas off of the dog of evolution, but when it comes down to picking the fleas off, you find they're just pieces of lint, not really serious problem for the dog. But you never seem to want to discuss your dog. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about religion. Talk about Noah's Ark, for example. Do you believe that there were dinosaurs on Noah's Ark, at least baby dinosaurs? Or
I don't make any reference to the Bible or biblical authority. I don't deal with that at all, and I really don't have an opinion about it.
You don't have an opinion. Okay, well, let's say that this book, which is widely distributed in creationist circles and used in schools, home schools, and religious schools at this point, has nothing to do with me. Well, I'm going to ask you about why you don't do something that those of us on this side do. Here's a little picture, man and the dinosaur. Adam wasn't scared to watch dinosaurs eat because all the creatures ate plants and not meat. Now, do you think that's good biology, number one?
I do not. And in fact, I have said on many occasions and have urged persons in the conservative Christian community to put aside the whole Bible issues and let us ask the question, what is actually known from scientific evidence as opposed to materialist philosophy about the claims of evolution?
You're a great lawyer, but you didn't answer the question. I want you to know, to tell us if you think that this is not so silly and dangerous kind of ideas to plant in the hands of high school students, that in fact the Flintstones are some kind of documentaries.
Yeah.
That's pretty dangerous.
Yeah. The kind of thing, I haven't seen this, the kind of thing you're encouraging certainly is silly, just almost as silly as the work of Richard Dawkins. And is damaging.
Professor Miller.
And I mean that, you see, and the work of those who say that material processes can explain the entire living world.
Go ahead, Ms. Scott.
No, that's all right.
Okay, I'm sure it will surprise no one. I have one more chart. And we have heard over and over again that there are gaps in the fossil record, there are missing forms, and it's been implied the only reason they could be there is because evolution is not the explanation. I want to show you a very famous gap. It's a gap between mesonekid mammals, land-dwelling carnivores that lived, 55, 60 million years ago, and archaeocetes, which were the oldest whales. We know from skull and dentition patterns that, as it turns out, these whales are very closely related to mesonekins. And my colleague directly across from me, Michael Behe, once wrote, if random evolution is true, there must be a large number of transitional forms between mesonekid and the ancient whale, and much in the way that Dr. Berlinski has said, he said, where are they? Well, they're right here. 2, 3. There turn out to be 3 transitional forms, including a complete skeleton named Ambulocetus natans, which turns out to be an extraordinary intermediate. And here's the point that I want to ask you. It turns out that all these fossils are found in the area where the Indus River empties into the Indian Ocean. They're all in the right sequence, and furthermore, they form a transitional series. Now, here's what I want to know, Phil. You keep saying, where are the transitional forms? Paleontologists dig them up. What's the matter with them?
Here's what the matter is. The most important point to me is that the fossil record is most conclusively un-Darwinian just where it's most complete, in marine invertebrates. And that is why it is shocking that one finds that where it's the most incomplete and where the imagination can have free play, that's where you get the examples. We don't know that these form a transitional sequence at all, and you don't know how it could have happened and by what mechanism. And if you do, I wish you'd publish the paper on it, because I'd love to see it torn to bits.
Hang on for a second. I don't want anyone to miss the point. Dr. Behe said, where's the transition? Philip Gingerich and others dug up not 1, not 2, but 3 transitionals.
Are they transitionals? We don't know that.
You know, I would think in a fair fight you'd say, you know, darn it, we were wrong on that one. You guys got the evidence. Okay, here's one for your side. But what's happening is...
I can quote to you from an article in Science says that they are not. Cannot be placed in an ancestor descendant to sequence.
No. Well, we're going to have to miss it. Thank you very much.
I'm done.
Professor. You're done. You're free. Thank you very much.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Ms. Scott. Ms. Scott, it's your turn. And who would like to begin the questioning? Mr. Berlinski.
Dr. Scott,
all right, go ahead.
Dr.
You're champion.
I asked the captain. He said okay. In the recent fundraising letter of National Center for Science Education, you state that when the ACLU wants to know what's this intelligent design stuff, we're there to inform them that it is indeed a religiously based alternative to evolution, completely outside of science. Okay, now let me give you a quote from an astronomer named Fred Hoyle, who discovered things called resonance energy levels for carbon, oxygen, and helium, and found that they are arranged exactly as they must be to support life. Hoyle wrote, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a superintellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me to be so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. I have 2 questions. How is his concluding intelligent design from the facts of astronomy different from concluding intelligent design from the facts of, say, the bacterial flagellum? And second, are you going to stick the ACLU on Fred Hoyle?
Fred Hoyle is a distinguished astronomer, as you pointed out. When he speaks about biological phenomena, I would not say that he speaks ex cathedra.
He was speaking
as a matter
about
of fact,
astronomy.
one of the statements that Fred Hoyle made with Chandra Wickramasinghe is that actually insects are smarter than they are, but they're just not letting us know.
He was speaking about astronomy
he
in this
has rather
quotation.
strange views about evolution, and I
But
would
he's
not
talking about
consider him an
astronomy.
authority.
But he's concluding intelligent design from astronomy.
Mr. Berlinski.
Dr. Scott, I find myself vexed by your cavalier attitude toward the evidence, especially with respect to the fossil record, and that's the only evidence that your side has presented with great vigor. Would you agree, as almost everyone else affirms, that the overwhelming pattern of the fossil record is sharply discontinuous?
Is what I'm sorry.
Sharply discontinuous.
Sure, it's discontinuous.
Okay, so we agree on that. Could I ask you to give us your best estimate of the number of changes required to take a dog-like mammal to a seagoing whale?
Can we, first of all, distinguish, which was confused, I think, during the questioning of Phil. Evolution is descent with modification. We all are quite convinced that this happened.
I'm not.
Darwinism, well, on my side of the table.
That's for sure. But I had a specific question.
I'm finishing. Darwinism, evolution by natural selection, is one of the ways by which evolution can take place. The argument that has been presented so frequently from your side of the table is that if all we have to do is disprove Darwinism and we disprove evolution. That's nonsense.
I'm trying to
Another
anchor
point,
the
I
discussion
will try to answer your question.
in
I'm sorry.
something factual and concrete, like a number.
Why do you assume that the fossils are the only source of data for evolution?
I certainly don't. You're absolutely right. But I'm talking about the whale, right? Large seagoing mammal. The thesis is that there's a Darwinian progression, and the evidence is 3 or 4 intermediates. I'm asking you to give us your best estimate of the number of changes required to take a dog-like mammal to a morphological, physiological. Just give us a number. Is it 3?
That's an absurd question.
Why?
None of us on the evolution side of this argument has ever proposed that we can come up with the number of changes.
Then
That's
how on earth can you commend the mechanism if you're unsure whether it's adequate to the result?
Why are you so fixated on the mechanism
Because
of
that's the
natural
heart of your
selection?
doctrine. It's a theory. It's a scientific theory.
Would you agree with me that if you disprove evolution, if you disprove natural selection, you therefore disprove evolution?
Sure.
You're wrong.
Why?
Because natural selection is only a way by which evolution
There is
can
no
take place.
other
The evidence will still be
attribute of the
there.
theory.
From
But go
homology,
back-
from anatomical homologies, biochemical homologies, and the fossil record. We're not dependent on the fossil record.
Focus on my question. I'm begging you. We have a theory.
I answered it.
The theory is the theory of random mutation and natural selection. I'm asking you to apply it to the case of the progression from a dog-like mammal to a seagoing
I'm begging you not to, so. Thank you very much, Ms. Scott. Mr. Berlinski. Mr. Berlinski, you're up. And Mr. Berlinski will question Professor Miller, and then Professor Miller will question Mr. Berlinski. Can I go first? Yes.
Professor Miller, would you agree with the statement that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution? It's very often quoted.
The statement you're making is made by Teodosis Dobzhansky.
It's often attributed to Ernst Mayr also.
Fair enough. And in a simple way, so I don't have word games played on me. No, I would not agree with it. I think there are things in biology that are perfectly sensible, even if evolution is not correct. However, our understanding of the interrelationships between organisms, phylogeny, and natural history does indeed only make sense in light of evolution.
But in terms of your own very fine work in cell biology, evolutionary theory plays no role whatsoever.
Does evolutionary theory play a role in my work?
Proton transport.
Thank you for complimenting my work. The answer is no, that's not correct. The reason for that is a few years ago, an investigator discovered a very interesting microorganism, a prokaryote called prochloron. Prochloron turned out to be the very first prokaryote, organism without a nucleus, discovered that had both chlorophyll A and B. This suggests very strongly that in an evolutionary sense, prochloron is the evolutionary ancestor of the chloroplasts of higher plants. This organism was sent to me because of the kind of structural work I do with the idea, let's put it to the test. because what we did in my lab was to investigate the structure of its photosynthetic membranes, and lo and behold, we found that they were enormously similar to higher plant chloroplasts. If they had been dissimilar, it might have been an argument against evolution. It turned out not to be the case.
That you have been invigorated by the shade of Charles Darwin, but the fact is that in your published scientific papers, the term evolution occurs as frequently as the term Presbyterian, which is to say not at all.
Well, I have to tell you once again, sir, you are wrong on the fact.
All right.
None of my 75-plus published referee papers uses the term Presbyterian. At least 3 of them use the term evolution.
I stand correct.
The details
odds
matter.
75-3 against the usefulness of evolution in your own scientific life. Let's leave that question aside and let's pass to another one, since I don't see any way of resolving that particular issue.
I still reject it on the terms. You say evolution is not useful. The very reason why we study the translocation of proteins in lower organisms such as yeast is because we believe we learn something about how our own cells work by studying other organisms, and the underpinning assumption for that is, in fact, evolutionary biology.
That's nonsense, and you know it. You study it because it's an interesting and accessible question. That's the only...
Well, sir, the only thing I can tell you is if it really was nonsense, the significant sections I write in the end of my grant applications to the National Institutes of Health would no longer be successful.
Could well be. Let's turn to the question I so vainly tried to prompt an answer from Dr. Scott. How many morphological changes do you think were required to affect the transition those charts of yours were sent to document?
Okay, now I will give you a straight answer. And the straight answer is that when you look at 2 species that are separated by 5 million years of geological time, the number of changes must be very, very large.
Give us an estimate.
However, recent studies of speciation, I'm sorry to pick this specific species, but it's relevant to your question. Recent studies of speciation in sunflowers have shown conclusively that a new species can be established in terms of the speciation isolation mechanism with as few as 10 genetic changes.
Yes,
that's your answer.
I've read the same science papers you have, but those are very close. A dog-like mammal and a whale are very far.
That's right. And the other end of the room is very far away, and it should not surprise you that I get there with 1 step at a time, and that's what we're
Can I conclude that you refuse... No matter the number I give you, you will neither assent nor disagree with the number. If I say there are 100,000 morphological changes required to take a dog-like mammal living on the land to a whale...
sir, yes, I will answer that. That's way too high. We believe that organisms, well, I shouldn't say we believe. The good genetic evidence is that there are about 100,000 genes in human beings. I would guess there's somewhat fewer in whales. What you're telling me is to change from one similar organism, an organism that looks more like a whale than any terrestrial animal that has ever lived, to a whale that looks more like a terrestrial animal than any whale has ever lived, would require every gene to change.
No, and I haven't talked about genes.
No, you asked me for a number, and I said on that basis, 100,000 is too high.
All right, 50,000?
My turn. Okay. Now, I have a question for you.
Yes.
You have said again and again and again that transitions are missing. And I hope no one in the audience missed the fact that Dr. Scott pointed out that the transition from reptiles to mammals, and looking around the room, I see I'm surrounded by mammals. This should be a point of interest to us. That transition is exceedingly well documented. Now, once again, you said all the transitionals are missing, and I'm confused. If this transition is very well documented, how can you on the same face say they're all missing?
You know very well I didn't say that. I agree that the late reptile to mammal sequence is well documented. No question about it.
Okay, let me go a little further. Horses and elephants. I pick these organisms because they're large, because they're recently evolved, and because they are recent, we've got lots of fossils. They're easy to pick out. The fossil record of horses and elephants is extremely well documented. Now, you said at the other end of the table you deny that descent with modification is correct. So here's what I'd like to know.
I said I didn't believe it.
You said I'm not convinced by it. I believe, sir, you did.
I said I'm not convinced.
So here's my question. If not descent with modification, please tell me your explanation for the temporal appearance of these extremely closely related, in morphological terms, organisms over time.
Okay, 2 points. First of all, I neither affirmed nor denied descent with modification. I said I have no opinion. I don't happen to have an opinion on that issue. It's vexed, in my opinion. Second of all, you have chosen 3, and the only 3 examples in the fossil record where there's a plausible Darwinian sequence. the dog-like mammal to whale sequence, the elephant sequence, and the horse
Are you
sequence.
absolutely sure I can't pick up a fourth planet?
No, of course not. Each one is seriously questioned in the literature. The elephant
Could you point out for the benefit of the audience what the question is? You said they're seriously questioned in the literature.
The question is, do we have a plausible sequence of morphological changes that lead to the late fossil form from the early fossil form by a route that makes morphological
And I would argue,
sense?
yes, we do, and I hope you've read Bruce McFadden's marvelous book.
It's an excellent book, and I
it's
cite
an
it in
excellent
my
book,
commentary
and
article.
he has put enormous effort into documenting those changes. So in legal terms, sir, case closed. We
No,
got
it's
it.
not closed. This isn't scientific argument. This is mere rhetoric. The horse sequence has proved vexed to everyone who looks at it, and the term of choice is that it's an astonishingly bushy sequence. We don't
Please
know.
Please explain the problem.
When you
I'm waiting for the answer.
When you look at what a bushy sequence is.
Yeah, this is a term that's occurred very often in literature. When we look at the horse sequence, we have dozens and dozens of species entering the record suddenly and departing from the record suddenly, just as abruptly as they entered. We do not really know whether the modern horse has ancestral patterns with the dozens of other species that we find in the fossil record.
So what
If
that
we
means
look
is
closely,
that you
if we
hold
look-
open.
wait a second.
Sure, go ahead.
If we look closely at some of the amazing structures, for example, we find it very difficult to find specific antecedents. The more we study such structures, the less plausible it is that they have an
And
ancestral
let me
pattern.
suggest to the audience that what Dr. Berlinski just said is in fact not correct. And I can recommend articles and books in which you can find not only a series of transitional forms, but also good evolutionary morphologic explanations for it.
I agree
And
with
here's
that.
the question that I have for you.
I agree
Once
with
again,
that. Well, let's
to
get
someone
my
who
agreement on the
advocates
record.
another question, to someone who advocates intelligent design.
I don't.
The fact to someone who advocates intelligent design, does the sequence of these organisms in the fossil record simply mean that the intelligent designer was incompetent, he kept making things and they went extinct, or that he was restless, I try this, I'll try that, I'll try the other thing, or does it mean that in fact these organisms are related with by descent with modification?
No idea. I mean, it's not a question I'm prepared to answer one way or another. I don't see why I'm obliged to answer that. I'm coming here under the large tent of objurgation. I find scientific flaws with the Darwinian theory. I don't have a replacement.
Okay. The point that I think is extremely significant is in this case, one side argued from authentic evidence and the other side said it's not enough to convince me. And I think that's a good way to end the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mark. Closing arguments. Closing arguments. First, Mary Lynn closing for the opposition.
Well, I hope that our side at least has done what I promised we would do from the beginning, and that is we have asked for alternative explanations for evolution, and we have gotten none. What have we gotten? Well, we have Mr. Berlinski, who has literally moments, seconds ago, said he doesn't really have an alternative. We asked Mr. Behe. He said, well, a lot of people would say it was God, but we're not quite sure, I'm not sure at least, whether he's prepared to say it's God with any sense of authority. Mr. Johnson says, well, I don't know about the biblical answers as an alternative. We'll work that out after we debunk evolution, which I think will be some time from now. We've made it clear that evolution is not a philosophy, it's not a religious idea, it's not an ideology, it's the best, indeed it's the only scientific explanation for the fact that there is change in the natural order. We asked about intelligent design and got, I think, the best answer from Mr. Behe. Mr. Behe has, of course, compared, like it or not, compared the extraordinary complexity of the human cell to the mouse trap. He said if we look at that mouse trap, it was created by a human. In fact, Mr. Miller improved on it, as you saw earlier tonight. Therefore, if that's complicated, then indeed the cell must also have been designed by an intelligence. And as I thought about it tonight, it's a little bit, we were all talking about nature analogies, it's a little bit like looking at a mole build a molehill. You say, that's very interesting. Then we walk out in the woods the next day and we notice a big mountain off in the distance. We say, good grief, that's enormously large. A really big mole must have built that. The truth of the matter is, it's not logical. We should be looking for different forces that result in different things. Your mousetrap was built by human hands because its components are inanimate objects. Cellular life is living, vibrant, breathing, changing matter. You're not just comparing apples to oranges, you're comparing plastic apples to organic oranges. And I think, therefore, this analogy fails. Let me close by saying, and speaking only for myself, because we do have a difference of religious opinion, I draw upon a scriptural passage which is dear to both Mr. Johnson and to myself. It comes from the first chapter of John's Gospel. It reads, "In the beginning was the Word." Indeed, that word just might turn out, literally, to have been a command. Evolve. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I compliment the negative on the way in which their arguments have been framed. What is it that we set out to say here? Namely that the notion of creation has not been invalidated by whatever loyalty is shown to the idea of evolution. That is to say, we have used the word intelligent design in order to reach for something that is not biblical in dimension, but nevertheless suggests that the miracles with which we are familiar are most probably miracles that didn't happen simply by chance. I think we all have reason to celebrate, in effect, the repudiation of materialist explanations that have been so studiously observed by eloquent adversaries. So let me just close by reading one paragraph from an essay written 20 years after Darwin. In 1864, there was a diocesan conference at Oxford. It chanced at this time to be in the neighborhood a man who was neither priest nor scientist, a man given to absurd freaks of intellectual charlatanry, yet showing at times also such marvelous and sudden penetration into the heart of things as would come only to genius. It was Disraeli. He began in his usual affected manner, slowly and rather pompously, as if he had nothing to say beyond the perfunctory platitudes, and then, turning to the presiding officer, he uttered one of his enigmatic and unforgettable epigrams. What is the question now placed before society? The question is this: is man an ape or an angel? I, my lord, am on the side of the angels. The audience, not kindly disposed to the speaker, applauded the words as a jest. They were carried the next day over the whole land by the newspapers. They have often been repeated as an example of Disraeli's brilliant but empty wit. I suspect that beneath their surface glitter and hidden within their metaphor, these words contain a truth that shall someday break to pieces the new philosophy which Huxley spent his life so devotedly to establish. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Buckley. Well, I'm glad that's settled. I'd like to thank our debaters, and I'd like to thank Seton Hall University, and I'm not going to tax anyone with my voice any longer. I apologize for that. And I guess we'll know in a few million years who's right and who's wrong about this. Thank you very much.